Welcome to the debate. Today we're taking a sledgehammer to, well, one of the most persistent pillars of modern nephrology, this doctrine of inevitable decline.
For decades, the textbook definition of chronic kidney disease, or CKD, has been a one-way street.
A very depressing one-way street.
Exactly. You get diagnosed, you manage symptoms, and you watch the numbers slowly drop until you hit end-stage renal disease. The best-case scenario was just, slowing the car down before it went off the cliff. But that whole narrative is cracking. We're seeing data that suggests the trajectory isn't always a straight line down. Sometimes it's a staccato progression, stops and starts, and in some cases, actual functional improvement.
And that brings us to the central question, which is incredibly high stakes. Is this reversal a biological reality we can actually harness? Or is it a mirage, or worse, a marker of physiological wasting that could actually lead us to harm patients by chasing a good number?
I think the skepticism is holding us back. I'm here to argue that the kidney is more plastic than we've given it credit for. I believe we're on a frontier where recovery is actually on the table.
And I'll be taking the opposing view. The inevitable decline model, while grim, is, I think, biologically accurate when it comes to structural damage. I believe focusing on reversal distracts us from the boring but life-saving work of managing cardiovascular risk, because that is what's really killing these patients.
All right, let's get into the weeds then. You mentioned inevitable decline. If that's an absolute law, how do you explain the data from the ASK trial, the African American study of kidney disease and hypertension? This was a gold standard long-term study. When they analyzed the eGFR, the speedometer for kidney function, they found a subset of patients who didn't just stabilize, they got better.
A subset, a very small subset.
It was 3.3% of the participants. And I know that sounds small, but don't just brush that off. These improvers had a mean increase of plus 1.06 ml per minute per year. Now compare that to the rest of the group who declined by minus 2.45. And statistically, this wasn't a fluke. The probability that these positive slopes were real was 0.95. If the kidney can't heal, that number should be 0. And it's not just AASK. Looking at the work by Lee and colleagues, they found that something like 41.6% of CKD patients follow a non-linear trajectory. It is not a straight slide down.
I'm not saying the number didn't go up. I'm questioning what the number means. 3.3% is statistically significant, sure. But in biology, rare events are often outliers, not, new paradigms. You have regression to the mean. A patient has a bad day, their numbers are down. Then they have a good day. The chart looks like improvement, but it's just fluctuation. But much more importantly, relying on that number brings us to the mortality paradox. And this is the elephant in the room that this kind of optimism tends to ignore.
Ah, yes. The idea that getting better is actually bad for you. I knew we'd end up here.
It sounds completely counterintuitive, but the data bears it out. Studies by Perkins, Alali, and others, they all found this disturbing correlation. An increase in eGFR is associated with an increased risk of death compared to patients who just stayed stable. Now, you have to pause and think about that. Why would better filtration kill you? Well, it doesn't, but we have to remember how we measure eGFR. It's an estimate based on serum creatinine.
And creatinine is a breakdown product of muscle.
Exactly. So if a patient gets very sick, cancer, heart failure, severe malnutrition, they lose muscle mass. They get sarcopenia. Less muscle means less creatinine in the blood. The formula sees that low creatinine and says, wow, great kidney function. But in reality, the patient is wasting away. So when you celebrate that positive slope, you might actually be cheering for a patient who is physically crumbling.
That is the classic argument, and it is a valid physiological trap for the unwary. If we were only looking at creatinine, I would probably agree with you. But the ASK trial specifically protects against that critique, and this is why I hang my hat on it.
How so?
Because for the trial phase, they didn't just use the creatinine estimate. They used 125 iothalamate clearance. That is the gold standard. It involves injecting a marker and directly measuring how fast the kidney clears it. It is completely independent of muscle mass, and even using that direct measurement, they saw the improvement, so you cannot blame sarcopenia for the ASK data.
Okay, I will concede that. Iothalamate strengthens the case for that specific 3.3%. It rules out the muscle wasting argument for them. But there's another physiological trick, hemodynamics. The kidney is a pressure system. If you change the blood flow, dilate the incoming artery, or constrict the outgoing one, you can temporarily ramp up filtration. It looks like functional recovery, but structurally the kidney is still damaged. It's like revving the engine on a car with a cracked chassis. The speedometer goes up, but you haven't fixed the car.
But look at the phenotype of those improvers in AASK. They weren't random. They were younger. They had lower baseline proteinuria, less protein leaking into the urine. This suggests we are looking at a healthier substrate. It implies that if we catch the disease early enough, before that protein load becomes toxic, the kidney retains a real reserve capacity.
I agree that proteinuria is the most critical marker we have, but I view it differently. Low proteinuria just means the patient isn't dying as fast. It doesn't mean they're regenerating. It means the holes in the filter aren't quite as big yet. And this brings me to the mechanism of progression. You talk about repair, I talk about the vicious cycle. We have to talk about acute kidney injury, or AKI.
The inciting event.
Right. And the literature is just crystal clear. AKI induces an 8.8-fold increase in the risk for CKD. It's a massive multiplier. And the mechanism isn't a mystery. It's vascular rarefication. Basically, the injury kills off the tiny peritubular capillaries that feed the kidney cells. The tissue becomes hypoxic. It suffocates. That hypoxia triggers fibrosis, which kills more capillaries, which causes more hypoxia. It's a death spiral. Once those capillaries are gone, they are gone. You can't perfuse tissue that has no plumbing.
You describe it as a death spiral. I see it as a window of intervention. That phase, following an AKI, the maladaptive repair phase, is dynamic. It's not instant scarring. The research indicates that if we can shift the balance of that repair, maybe using agents that target those specific pathways, we can prevent the transition to fibrosis.
If is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence.
But we're finding the levers. We know from animal models that bone morphogenic protein 7, or BMP7, is key. It's a morphogen in the adult kidney that suppresses fibrosis. Chronic injury turns it off. But restoring it in animal models actually reverses lesions. It literally melts the scar tissue. And it's not just that. Look at epigenetic modifiers. We're finding that histone deacetylase inhibitors can block renal fibroblast activation. This suggests the fibrotic state is maintained by software, epigenetics, not just hardware, and we can rewrite the code.
I admire the optimism, I really do. But we have to look at the graveyard of clinical trials. Nephrology is just littered with drugs that looked great in the maladaptive repair phase in mice and then completely failed in humans. Mice are not men. We've cured everything in mice. Remember the Beacon trial, bardoxolone?
That was unfortunate.
It was. It was a disaster. It was supposed to be the great new hope for inflammation and oxidative stress. It increased eGFR, sure, the numbers looked pretty, but it also caused heart failure and fluid overload. The trial had to be stopped. Or take the Altitude trial with Alice Caron, stopped early due to adverse events.
Well, science advances through failure. We learn what doesn't work.
But the failures highlight the danger of intervening in such a fragile system. Even the logic of dual RAS blockade, combining an ACE inhibitor and an ARB to completely shut down the pressure system. It made total sense on paper, but the on-target and VA Nephron D trials showed us that while it reduced protein leak, it drastically increased the risk of hyperkalemia and acute kidney injury. We tried to save the kidney and ended up poisoning the patient with potassium.
I'm not convinced by the dual RAS example as a permanent failure. Those trials used full doses of both agents. That is a sledgehammer approach. Of course you got toxicity. The valid trial is looking at half doses of both to balance efficacy and safety. We're learning nuance. We're learning to use a scalpel instead of a hammer.
It's a steep learning curve for the patients who are involved.
But look where we are succeeding. Endothelin receptor antagonists, atrasentan. In the RADAR study, it reduced albuminuria by 35 to 38%. That's massive.
Atrasentan is interesting, I'll give you that. It's more selective than the older drugs like avacosentan that caused massive fluid overload. But again, reducing albuminuria is a surrogate endpoint. It's a great sign, but it's not the same as stopping dialysis or death.
Then look at CCX140. It's a CCR2 inhibitor. It targets inflammation directly. It reduced albuminuria by 24% on top of standard care. We are finally moving beyond just managing blood pressure, and we cannot ignore the biggest game changer of the last decade, SGLT2 inhibitors.
I was wondering when you were going to play that card.
Empagliflozin, dapagliflozin. These drugs didn't just stabilize glucose, they markedly decreased kidney disease progression. And importantly, they address your biggest fear.
Cardiovascular death.
Exactly.
And this is really the crux of my argument. We can debate kidney cell regeneration all day long, but the grim statistic remains. Patients with CKD are 20 times more likely to die from a heart attack or stroke than they are to survive long enough to need dialysis. 20 times. So when you talk about reversal of kidney function, I worry we're looking at a localized success in a system that is fundamentally crumbling.
But that is exactly why SGLT2 inhibitors are the bridge between our viewpoints. They protect the heart and the kidney. They prove that the goals are not mutually exclusive. Stabilizing eGFR is crucial for heart health.
SGLT2s are a win. I use them. But let's be precise about what they do. They are a preservation tool, not a reversal tool. They slow the decline. They put the brakes on. They don't regrow the nephron. My concern is that the whole narrative of reversal distracts from safety monitoring. You mentioned the improvers in ASK. I still argue that unless you're carefully monitoring for cardiac cachexia, heart failure leading to muscle loss, you are flying blind.
We're not flying blind anymore, though. We have better sensors. We have biomarkers now like SUPAR and ApoA4. High levels of soluble urokinase receptor, SUPAR, predict decline in patients who still have a normal eGFR. If we can detect the risk that early, before the vicious cycle you describe even starts, we have a chance to intervene. We can identify the patients destined for that linear decline and disrupt it.
I will agree that SUPAR and KIM1 are promising. Identifying the rapid progressors is essential. But detecting a train wreck earlier doesn't mean you can stop the train. My philosophy remains, once you have established CKD stage 3 or 4, the focus must be on preservation and safety, managing blood pressure, managing metabolic acidosis, avoiding nephrotoxins. The narrative of reversal suggests we can turn back the clock. I believe we should be focused on keeping the clock from running out.
Preservation is a self-limiting ambition. If 3.3% can improve in a trial from 20 years ago, how many could improve with today's medicine? The nonlinear trajectory observed by Li et al. Shows us that decline isn't a law of physics. It stops. It starts. That staccato rhythm implies there are periods of repair fighting against periods of injury. Our job is to help extend the repair periods.
Oris, the staccato rhythm implies episodes of acute injury followed by stabilization, but never a return to baseline, a step-down pattern. You step down, you hold. You step down again, you hold. That fits the vascular rarefication model perfectly. You lose a capillary bed, function drops, and you stabilize at that new lower level.
That's one interpretation. But functional reserve allows for compensation. If we use agents that lower the workload like SGLT2s and agents that reduce the scarring signal like these emerging antagonists, we might find that the step down can become a ramp up. We know resident stem cells exist in the kidney. Their contribution is debated, I admit, but they are there. If the environment is less toxic, why wouldn't they contribute to repair?
Of cells, it regenerates easily. The kidney is this finely tuned filter with millions of specific tubes and vessels. If you destroy that architecture, stem cells don't know where to go. It's like trying to rebuild a skyscraper after it collapses just by dumping new bricks on the pile.
It's a compelling analogy, but perhaps too pessimistic. I go back to the ASK data. Those people existed. They were measured with the gold standard. They improved. Even if it's rare, it proves the concept is possible. And if it's possible, it is our job to figure out how to scale it.
I remain skeptical. The mortality paradox hangs over every improvement in eGFR. Unless you can prove to me that muscle mass is stable and the improvement is verified by something like iothalamate or cystatin C, I will always assume a rising eGFR in a sick patient is a danger signal, not a victory.
And I maintain that while we must rule out wasting, we cannot ignore the clear signal from the ASK trial that for some patients, younger, less proteinuric, the kidney can heal. Dismissing this as noise denies us the opportunity to understand how they heal.
We're nearing the end of our time, and we seem to have reached a pretty fundamental divergence in philosophy.
It seems so.
To summarize my position, while stable CKD is a crucial clinical goal, I believe the narrative of reversal remains unproven and frankly potentially dangerous if it ignores the context of sarcopenia and mortality. The vicious cycle of fibrosis and vascular loss is a formidable enemy, and that 20-fold increase in cardiovascular mortality, that should remain the primary focus of management. We should be treating the patient's survival, not just the slope of a line on a chart.
And to summarize mine, the data proves CKD is not always a linear march to dialysis. 3.3% of patients in a rigorous trial improved, and that is a foothold for hope. New tools like KIM1 and NGAL allow us to identify risk with precision, and new agents like SGLT2 inhibitors and endotheliin antagonists are giving us levers we never had before. Resigning patients to inevitable decline ignores the biological reality that repair is possible.
It is a debate that will likely continue until we have 20-year data on these new agents.
On that, we can certainly agree. Whether one views the trajectory as potential for improvement or management of decline, the nonlinear nature of this disease demands our constant vigilance and personalized monitoring. Thank you for listening. Until next time on The Debate.